I'm the chair of Grand Rounds today. Thanks for waiting. There's a slight IT difficulties with Perth. We are now connected to them, but there's no one there, so typical, really. But they may appear. As I say, Alan Connick and his bag of crisps may turn up in due course. Now, before we get on to the main event, which is iLFTs, Intelligently Reporting Liver Function Tests, with Professor John Dillon and Dr. Ellie Dow, I've been asked by the Dundee Society of Medical Technology, as led by Rodney Mountain, to play this video. Is that right? So the video should be self-evident. If you are a medical student, you'd be very interested. If you look after medical students, then you might be interested. If you have an interesting idea about something, you might be interested. I'll play the video and we'll see what you think. Right, so who writes the music for those things, huh? Yeah, it's the ubiquitous tinkly music. But they want intelligent ideas for current problems. If you're an intelligent person with a problem and you can solve it, then come along, go to the website, and they will support you. Speaking of intelligence, only Professor Dillon here to talk about intelligently managing abnormal liver function tests. Okay, thanks so much.
I can promise you no musical interludes into this, and just the droning tone of my voice interrupted by Dr. Dow halfway through. So, we want to talk about liver function tests and what happens to them, and if those of you have arrived for a tutorial on how to investigate the liver, you can leave now, because that's not what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the size of a problem. So this is age-standardised mortality for under 65 deaths in the UK from 1970 to 2006. Everything is getting better except liver disease, despite the fact we've now got more hepatologists in the UK than we've ever had before. So the obvious solution is hepatologists are crap, you should get rid of us. So this year probably liver disease will be the commonest cause of death under 65 in the UK, which is pretty sad news in terms of, everything else has got better, and we are about 500% worse than we were 40 odd years ago. And then if we think about those causes, it's alcohol, it's non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, hepatitis C with the new treatments is diminishing as a cause of death, and then the other rarer underlying liver diseases like primary biliary cirrhosis, autoimmune hepatitis, hepatitis B, hemochromatosis, and the rest of the list. And it's chronic liver disease that is driving that death rate. Clearly alcohol and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease leading the charge. And if you look at the size of the problem from a liver function test point of view, we did the LFT study from 1989 to 1997, where we discovered there were 1.5 million liver function tests requested in that time frame. And 12 to 17% of those tests were abnormal, depending which definition of abnormality you used. And more than 6,000 patients had had a single test done, it was abnormal, and no one did anything until they were. So there are windows of opportunity here if we want to intervene about those patients of dying. And only 10% of the abnormal tests were explained by existing liver disease. We updated this from 1989 to 2007, and we found incident liver function tests in 310,511 patients. The total population of Tayside who were alive at that time and lived in Tayside for any period of time was 550,000. So nearly 2/3 of the population had their liver function tests checked, which is a huge amount of work, as I'm sure our colleagues in biochemistry will vote for as the ever-increasing numbers of tests come through. And if liver function tests are supposed to be diagnostic of liver disease, it should, help us change that red line shape. So 95,000 patients had their first incident liver function test tested in general practice for no apparent reason. They weren't on a drug that needed monitoring, they weren't obviously jaundiced, they just had them done. And of these, 21% of them had an abnormality, and only 1.3% developed liver disease over the following 3.5 years. Now, that's not long enough for the natural history of liver disease, which is about 20 years, but it shows you the scale and size of the problem. And again, over 70% of these patients with an abnormality had no further investigation. Nothing was done with them. And you can see this is number of patients tested by year from 1989 to 2003, and that line has just carried on going up. So there is a huge amount of testing done, and we're now using liver function tests almost as a routine test of wellness, and there must be something wrong with you and that sort of thing. But we're not responding to them and not dealing with them appropriately. And in liver disease, we're trying to look for the perfect test, and they're trying to work it out. Now, our perfect gold standard test of liver biopsy only manages to diagnose patients with cirrhosis 70% of the time. So it's not a gold standard because the sample isn't the right size or whatever. Normal liver function tests are not normal because of our ALT ranges. We quote you an ALT value of above 55. If you actually take healthy, normal people, if you're a woman, your ALT will be below 19. If you're a man, it will be below 30. So if you apply that fact to our population, you will then increase the rate of abnormality of your liver function tests from 20% to 42%. So suddenly half the population don't have normal liver function tests anymore. Liver function tests, unsurprisingly, do not measure liver function. Other than the bilirubin and the albumin, the rest of them are liver damage tests and don't tell us what's going on. Abnormal liver function tests often don't mean liver disease, they mean systemic disease elsewhere, as we're all aware of, which leaves hepatologists as the mystic meg of liver function tests, that you're somehow left in a quandary as to what to do with them and how to handle them. So what actually is the problem? Well, the problem of non-investigation is ignoring or losing the result. There's that 42 moment where you were investigating a problem, you did a set of tests that you didn't really supposed to have done because it didn't really help you with the problem you were sorting out, and then not answering the question, and it's abnormal, and what the hell do you do with it? Because it's not sorted out your problem. Much liver disease is complicated and some of it's relatively rare, and so people get confused about it. It's that thing, I remember I had that lecture in medical school, it was all a bit confusing and there were lots of graphs. And there are too many of them. If we are talking about 40% of the population, 20% of the population abnormal, that's just a huge chunk of our workload. So what happens at the moment so we're going to focus this whole thing on general practice, okay? So it's not hospital practice because we're the upstream pipe, if you like, the consequence of what happens. So what happens at the moment? So the GP, for some reason, decides to check liver function tests on a patient's blood. The result is returned, and in 20% of cases will be abnormal, and the GP can decide to ignore the result, assume that it's normal for the patient, assume that the patient's drinking too much, and these may be valid clinical reasons, and leave the results to one side. They can arrange to see the patient. Now, clearly, if the patient agrees and turns up, the standard practice at the moment would be to repeat the LFTs, and in over 85% of cases they will come back and they will still be abnormal. So it hasn't got you any further. You haven't made them disappear and go away. And at some point, the GP can then arrange a series of blood tests to look for the cause of the liver disease and an ultrasound. And this is going to be viral serology, immunology looking for autoimmune liver disease, ferritin looking for hemochromatosis, and then the alpha-1 antitrypsin, ceruloplasmins, etc. in the younger patients. Or there can be further cycles of repeats with additional appointments and staff venipuncture. And at any stage, the GP can also refer the patient into secondary care. So on average, and with the variation and loss from the system, there are 6 contacts and less than 50% have proper follow-up. So that's what happens at the moment. That's the standard of care. So we thought we wanted to come up with a solution, in part driven by the Scottish Government wagging its finger at us about that big red line and saying something must be done. How can you solve the problem? Can we just cure it all by curing hepatitis C, which sadly we can cure all the hepatitis C. We are doing that, but it's not going to change the shape of the red line. So the first part of the solution was to bring together a group of hepatologists, locked them in a room, gave them lots of coffee, and made them come up with minimum diagnostic criteria for all the liver diseases we could think of. And the only criteria they were allowed were the liver function tests themselves and knowing the patient's BMI, the patient's alcohol intake, and whether they had any features of the metabolic syndrome. And that was all they were allowed to know. And so they developed criteria that would allow you to confidently make a diagnosis. So it wasn't diagnosing everybody with that disease, but you could pick people out. So rather like picking straw, dividing the pile by making it smaller, by taking out the easy stuff that was blindingly obvious. Okay? And that, in addition to the liver function test, they had a liver screen results, so they knew the viral serology, they knew the immunology, they knew the ferritin, they knew the alpha-1 antitrypsin status and the ceruloplasmin. And that allows us to allocate patients into 3 broad groups. There are those that have serious and complex liver disease that require secondary care, such as autoimmune liver disease, etc. There are those that have less serious disease, alcohol-related liver disease and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease without fibrosis. And there are those that we are unable to make a diagnosis on with the available information. Okay? So we can achieve that bit of it. We went on and did a validation of that and looked at secondary care outpatients to find out what happened to it. And so we followed consecutive referrals in who had that screen done. We did it in Glasgow, Aberdeen, Dundee. The exclusions were focal lesions, a dilated biliary tree, diagnosed liver disease or jaundiced. And we then we looked at the iLIFT, intelligent liver function diagnosis and referral recommendation compared to what the hepatologist who saw the patient actually thought the diagnosis was. So 378 patients, and iLIFT got the answer right 295 times. It got it wrong 28 times. If you looked at the 28 times, in 23 cases, the patients failed safe. So the algorithm was designed not necessarily to be accurate, but if there was dubiety about the patient, they would be referred. So if they had a positive smooth muscle antibody in someone who drank a huge amount, the diagnosis is almost certainly going to be alcohol-related liver disease, but they were still referred so that someone could make a definitive, sensible decision about that. So that's some of them, and some of them, their fibrosis markers were indeterminate, and that meant that they were referred for further evaluation. There were 5 patients that we got wrong. 2 of them were resolving viral hepatitis, and we were basing it on the blood results after the hepatitis, so we changed the algorithm to fix that. 1 was a vascular rarity that they had clots of their superior mesenteric and splenic veins and was causing a degree of portal hypertension from that reason. That was picked up on ultrasound. And in 2 cases, the fibrosis staging tools that we're using understaged liver disease, and we know they are about 95% accurate, so we were expecting that degree of failure. Interestingly, if you looked at that from the point of view of all the people that would have been that were being referred, 116 of them, a third of them, could have been looked after in general practice without referral. So my hepatological colleagues were delighted it was going to make our outpatients smaller and easier. But we might have to go and see some luminal disease instead, which wouldn't be quite so good. The next part of the solution is to look at fibrosis markers. These have been around for a long while. They're based on routine analytes that we measure already, and they're the FIB4, the APRI score, and some others. And these are good at splitting patients into 3 broad groups. Those that definitely have cirrhosis, those that definitely don't, and an indeterminate group where the result is not clear-cut, and you can change the cut-offs accordingly. So we've used them from the point of view of identifying the group that definitely don't have fibrosis. And for a asymptomatic general practice population, that's likely to be the vast majority of patients. So we've used the low cut-off, and we now have a great deal of confidence in their negative predictive value. And we're able to calculate those automatically on the blood results and what happens. And the third part is the tracked systems that are in clinical chemistry. And do you want to take over at this point, Ellie? Sure.
Thanks, John. So the next stage in the process in developing all of this depends really on new technology and developments within the lab system. In a nutshell, new hardware, nice train track connecting the hardware, updated new developments in IT, and basically GP send us a sample. If bits of it are abnormal, we automatically add on all sorts of tests. We generate all of those results together, and then we give them a management plan, and that's available through ICE. And that's it, really, in a nutshell. So I'd like to go into a little bit more about the actual technology about that, because the vision we had was that this should be very, very simple for the GPs. At the moment, if they want liver function tests, it's a one-tick box on ICE. So we wanted as much as possible, if they want intelligent liver function tests with an intelligent, helpful result that they can work with, it should also be a one-tick box, and they should get a management plan. But the actual in-between all of that, the black blocks in that, underlying that, is really quite complex. So what do you need if you're going to set that up from scratch, bearing in mind that the work that you're hearing today is probably the culmination of about 3 years worth of work? You need people with the right enthusiasm and skill set for this. You need an order comm system. We're very lucky in Tayside that we have the ICE system, because there's a lot that we can do with that. You need very sophisticated laboratory hardware with a train track. You might be able to do it without that, but I think it would be very challenging and could have a lot of pitfalls. You need very good, robust laboratory IT and people who know how to program the IT. You need an order comm system that's actually going to give results. So, for instance, in one of our partner labs elsewhere in Scotland who are looking at this, they have an order comm system, but only does one bit of it, only does requesting and doesn't do reporting. So this might be a bit challenging for them. And you need also, as part in the background, you need somewhere to store your documentation and your information and management plans that people can access. It's really important that people are able to work together, because this is not the work of one department. You know, this is a whole team effort involved in this, from hepatology, everybody in blood sciences, from haematology, chemistry, immunology. And I think great credit has to be given to our virology colleagues, because they were prepared to give up some of their tests for us to run for them, you know, and release ownership in a way. And without that, we wouldn't actually have been able to make this work. So you need somebody like this chap, who's Ian Kennedy, who's our very much behind-the-scenes IT manager. He probably wouldn't even want his picture being on public release like this. He prefers to remain anonymous. Ian and I are the ones who are responsible for all the programming within the ICE system and within the lab system so that this basically works. You need an immunologist. You need an immunologist who's prepared to be involved and is prepared to take the time to review the results and the data of the samples that are sent to them. So from the ICE point of view, you're used to using it in secondary care. The system's tailored slightly differently for primary care, so they have their own specific pages with their own specific tests. It needs to be programmable with rules. This means that it can ensure that we get the right information from the system and that we get the right samples. And the big breakthrough really was being able to get clinical information available, sent to us from ICE, so that it could be used within the laboratory system to actually, for data manipulation. John's talked about the fibrosis scores. You know, we need platelet counts, we need BMIs, we need alcohol intake for that. And that's not something that we can scrape out of clinical details. We need another means of actually getting that. These are two rather poor pictures, actually, of what the inside of the main core laboratory looks like. The train tracks in the middle with various analytical stations all around, multiple haematology analysers, multiple chemistry analysers doing a number of things. They also do some of the virology tests and some of the immunology testing. As I said, the train track connects everything, the software connecting to the train track and the LIMS, the laboratory IT system sitting on top of that, makes all of this reflex testing possible. So the laboratory system, we've actually had this for a very, very long time. You'll see a screenshot of it shortly. It's not particularly state-of-the-art in the sense that it's not user-friendly, it's not web-based, it doesn't have pretty coloured screens, it's got strange hieroglyphics and codings on it, so it's not the sort of thing you could walk in and just look at and think, yeah, I can do that. It's not like word processing, but it is very, very programmable, and it has allowed us to actually put in all the fibrosis scores and all the reflex testing that we require in order for this to work. Dummy tests, those are not stupid tests, those are false tests. These are what we have in ICE that allow us to actually bring over clinical information in a manipulatable way. So, for instance, I said we needed the BMI. Now, in an ideal world, we would be able to somehow magically scrape that out of the GP system, but that sort of capability and connectivity doesn't exist. So we actually have tick boxes for dummy tests for BMIs. They choose the BMI that's the closest to the patient one. That comes in as a test into the lab system that auto-reports with the number that we need to manipulate for the fibrosis scores. And that's one of the basis of this working. And also the LIMS system lets us do, as I said, these complex calculations. This is what the lab IT system actually looks like. This is our dummy test, who's the sickest person in Tayside. So this is what I would see when we actually look at the iLIFT results. The yellow circle is round the other thing that was the big breakthrough. Now, this is not going to sound like much to you, but this took us 2 years to achieve, to get the ability of the lab system to actually report a hyperlink, a workable hyperlink that somebody could click on. So a workable hyperlink in the lab system that translates, again, a further 2 years to get a workable hyperlink in ICE. Small things, but huge steps. So the reporting IT, we use ICE, and we have to have the active hyperlink in it. This is what it looks like if the GP goes into ICE. The details are at the bottom, and the actual area to click on for the management plan is at the top, in the top red circle. We can take multiple results, so you can have more than one diagnosis under iLIFT, depending on what the pattern of results, test results is, and that works really quite well. These are hyperlinks, but they need to go somewhere. So the actual documents, the 30-odd management plans that we have for the GPs are actually sitting in the document store. So they're available within the intranet. If we were spreading this elsewhere outside Tayside, we would have to have this accessible on the internet as opposed to the intranet. So, if you're programming ICE, it's a single tick box. The clinical data, as I said, comes over as tick boxes for the BMI, alcohol intake, and whether they've got metabolic syndrome or not. They complete the test, it prints out the labels, and there are basically 3 tubes we require, one purple top and 2 gold top, and that's it. It comes into the lab system. It does a core liver function group, which is slightly different from the normal one, in that we also include a gamma GT with this. And if any of these parameters are exceeded, so John's already talked about the cutoffs we use for ALT for men and women, they're much lower than you would see in a normal report. We use a cutoff of 200 for an alkaline phosphatase. This is a fudge factor, really, because we currently use a national consensus result for alkaline phosphatase. Many of the ALK-PHOS results are non-specifically abnormal. We don't want to have huge numbers of these cascaded. And we know from the work, we've got Callum Fraser sitting here in the department, that alkaline phosphatase has really quite marked biological variation and a whole reference interval across age groups that we no longer actually quote. And we use a cutoff of 75 for gamma GT. I put bilirubin in brackets because although we don't cascade the main iLIFT pathway through this, we do report on it to take into account people who've got sole elevations of bilirubin for Gilbert's disease, and also people who've got a markedly elevated bilirubin that we would want referred to fast-track jaundice clinic. Okay. So there are your cascade tests, AST, alpha-1 antitrypsin, ferritin and iron studies, platelet counts, hepatitis serology. We calculate the fibrosis scores. We only do a coruloplasmin in the younger age group. Those go to Glasgow, so there's no immediate report on those. That will be a subsequent PDF released. And depending on the bilirubins, we may or may not do a haptoglobin. How do we communicate to our other colleagues? Because obviously those tests are on the whole on the main core lab in blood sciences. The virology tests need confirmation, so we use another IT system to communicate to virology and to immunology that there are further tests, further samples for them to actually do further work on. Our lab IT system goes through about 20 pages of logic rules to actually generate a result. And we produce one of 31 PDF types for the GP to look at. Now, the time scale of that, you might think that takes hours, but if, for instance, we had the Westgate practice, which is very close to the hospital involved in the trial for this, they could have a patient in to be bled at 9:30. We might receive the sample by 11. We could generate a PDF result for them by 1 o'clock. So this can be very, very fast in the right circumstances. With everything, obviously hugely complex technology, there are problems and pitfalls. Making sure they've got the right selection. This is not really designed for acutely ill patients, so they shouldn't be using it in that setting. If they don't complete the tick boxes, we don't get the data that we can manipulate, and we don't get the samples. Doesn't work with paper requests because we don't get the information that we need. And if we don't get the right samples, we can't complete the actual algorithm. To look at the results, it is best if they use the intranet. And one of the big issues that we had with primary care was that they didn't particularly want to use an extra click and go into ICE to click and get the PDF. So we found ways for going live with this to get around that particular problem. So I'm going to go back to John now, and he's going to take us through the actual study that we did in practices in Tayside.
Okay, so we're grateful to CSO for funding it. It was a step wedge trial based in 6 general practices in Tayside, and control arm of abnormal LFT results, and then the intervention prospectively. Because it was a step wedge trial, we used each practice its own control, so there was a 6-month window before the intervention and then 6 months afterwards. We didn't reverse the order of the intervention because of an educational effect from the intervention would change general practice, possibly. We've already been through this, but that's what it looks like. So there's a little box at the bottom, and actually if you tick the iLIFT box, there are less ticks involved than if you request liver function tests. So it's not too bad. And then you add in the BMI that was within range, whether they had the metabolic syndrome, and how much they drank, and it was just whether they were above or below national recommended units. And then Ellie's already gone through how the reports would be generated and all the different diagnoses possible. So this patient, again, it's I think our sick patient, Laura Balowski, has alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, has alcoholic liver disease with fibrosis and hemochromatosis as well. So we talked about the liver function tests or the treatment plans, and basically the management plans were either for the diagnosis ones, and if we were offering a description only for the GPs, there were suggestions as to what they should do, revisiting the history about alcohol, checking for drug interactions and reactions, etc. And we can share those with you at another time. I'm sure you don't want to go through all 31 plans now. No volunteers. So this is the control group. And if you looked at what happened, there were 64 patients. There were 490 patients in total in the control group in the 6 months running in who had liver function tests done for the first time, didn't have a chronic liver disease, and wasn't part of disease monitoring. Those were the indications for those from those 6 practices. 13% of them had a diagnosed abnormal liver function test that was liver-related, and 11% had systemic disease or biliary disease. 16% there was the LFTs normalised with no diagnosis, and in 44% the LFTs were not rechecked and not investigated. And the diagnoses identified were alcohol-related liver disease, unspecified in 30, and NAFLD unspecified severity in 21. So So if we then went on to the outcome, you can see here the final outcome as a pie chart, and this is the undiagnosed. These basically are the undiagnosed bits, and it's about a quarter of the patients that end up with a diagnosis, which is better than in some of the other earlier studies. But we were dealing with practices that had volunteered for a research study on the investigation of liver function tests, so we assume they have to be the best there is. If we look at the intervention group, so we had 83 diagnoses in 65 patients, and we managed to get a diagnosis in 61% of them, undiagnosed in 39%, but we were able to identify fibrosis within 10 of those, which was clearly a more important thing. Because of the fibrosis markers, we're able to allocate patients, for instance, with alcohol-related liver disease from those with fibrosis and those without fibrosis. So a big jump in the diagnostic range from less than a quarter to well over half. And this is the outcome. And interestingly, the groups that got most squeezed were those that normalised and no diagnosis. So those that previously would have been uninvestigated and lost turned up, and we found 3 or 4 cirrhotics amongst that group, which were just missed because they would have been missed otherwise. So that was a surprise to us. Unsurprisingly, the rest of the additional diagnoses came from those patients that weren't investigated previously. And this is the comparator between the two, and you can see that these are the two big groups that got squeezed and where we got the extra diagnoses from. So overall, if you look at the control group and the iLIFT group, the control group, the mean trial cost from a health economic point of view was £185 per patient. Remember, over 50% of the patients were not investigated, and in a quarter of the rest of them, they were suboptimally investigated. Full investigation in iLIFT costs £328. Okay, so that's an ISA of 2 with the change in quality quality adjusted life years saved. It's an ISA of £284. Because of the life model that we used for this, assuming fairly conservative intervention, so assuming that for a quarter of the patients with alcohol-related liver disease, and the interventions changed the course of that illness, and for a quarter of the patients with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, the intervention changed. The intervention being stop drinking, stop eating, move more, and wagging a finger is very important. That from trial evidence, at least 25% of patients respond to that. So assuming that very baseline thing, we save £3,000 per patient with abnormal liver function tests for the patient. Okay, so the iLIFT strategy is dominant and removes it, even compared to suboptimal investigation. We looked at the alternative abnormal range thing, the gap between using the ALT value above 55 and then using it between 55 and 19 for women, 55 and 30 for men, and we found a significant additional load of liver disease hiding in that process, and I won't go through that today in the interest of time, but we may need to revisit looking at the alternative normal range. So overall, in the control group, we had 480 patients, 100% with abnormal liver function tests, and 64 of them ended up with a diagnosis at the end of the process. In the intervention group, 229 patients were recruited, 88 had an abnormality, and of these patients we managed to manage in primary care, 21 without fibrosis, 22 needed some further fibrosis assessment, but after that assessment would have been managed in primary care. We were unable to put a diagnosis on 21 of the cases. In many of those they had NAFLD or non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and from our algorithm we required a full house of metabolic syndrome, high BMI and evidence of diabetes before we assigned the diagnosis, and the majority of those undiagnosed patients had fatty liver disease, and 24, so about a quarter, actually required referral to secondary care for management of more complicated disease. So overall, this system delivers high-quality investigation to 100% of the patients rather than only a quarter. It's got a diagnostic accuracy of over 90%. There will be an 80% reduction in GP contacts compared to conventional gold standard care. So if you investigated these patients properly, you'd reduce your workload by 80%. There's a 75% reduction in the need of referral to secondary care. However, many more patients are being diagnosed, so overall it's neutral to secondary care. So we'll end up with the same number of patients, but there'll be patients who are sicker and need to be seen by us. It's cost saving to the NHS. There's an incremental cost of £284, but the lifetime saving is £3,000 per patient, and it's life saving in terms of it improves your quality adjusted life years saved. So it's delivering earlier identification of treatable liver disease by the smarter application of existing knowledge and technology. So I'd emphasise that all of those systems that we've used are in the lab and existed already. We've just reprogrammed them and repurposed them to achieve this integrated move forward. In terms of what's happening now, NHS Tayside is rolling this out and is likely to be live across Tayside towards the end of the year. Across Scotland, the Modernising Outpatients Consortium is keen to have this rolled out across Scotland, and we're just at the moment evaluating the various IT and lab systems across the 14 health boards as to which of them can copy us. And unsurprisingly, with the great success of NHS IT purchasing, not a single health board has an identical system to ours, and so we'll have to develop individual solutions to how to use their existing equipment for it. And mostly, I'd like to thank all of our collaborators and all the people who actually did all of the work, particularly the GPs and the patients involved, and the CSO for funding. Thank you very much.
Too slow. That's a fantastic piece of work, isn't it? I think that's really interesting. Your quality improvement is very small. And I suspect this is the aim here is not actually to extend people's lives, it's to pick up the right people and stop the flow, King Canute, sat on the beach.
The majority of the diseases we're finding are not liver disease, so it's getting more accurate diagnosis for them. And we are using fairly modest interventions around liver disease. The Hep C side of things we haven't modelled because we didn't find many patients, but clearly 1% of the Scottish population have Hep C, and that's a much bigger impact now, and this will pick up a lot of the lost missing patients that will present with end-stage disease. So that's a very conservative quality thing, but it's 2%. It's not bad for. There aren't many interventions that would show.
No, don't get me wrong. I think the whole thing's fantastic. What sticks in my mind is how we could extend this to other things. What other specialities are sitting out there thinking this is a great idea for my haematology screening, or and I know that rheumatology along with immunology have set up the connective tissue disorder screen test that went live just last month, I think. So don't search for the A&A button, it ain't there anymore. You have to press the button that says connective tissue disorder screen, and that will do all the tests for you. It takes away all that, what on earth is an anti-Joe or an anti-Ro or an anti-Lala, actually make it, what does that mean? Does anyone have any questions? Anyone want any questions or comments? Anything you'd like to say? Nigel, I'll make my way over to you.
Thank you. Just a couple of thoughts. In these days of fragmented, locum cover and everything, if they go through the system once, are they then blackballed? So if the GP puts the chi in, ticks iLFTs, they then see the locum 2 weeks later, is that candidate blackballed to go through the system again?
Yeah, they won't get through again, so that we won't repeat the test. It gives us much more control over it. We are opening up for those patients that had alcohol-related liver disease, fatty liver disease, etc., who had low fibrosis scores. The GPs will have the option subsequently of requesting the fibrosis components of that, not repeating the whole screen, but being able to monitor the patient to ensure that their liver disease isn't getting worse if they haven't listened about the alcohol or the general lifestyle advice. So they'll have that iLIFT option, but it'll be an iLIFT follow-up option.
Right. Financial modelling is really difficult, isn't it?
Yes.
Do you think the increasing incidence of liver disease will negate your savings because of the numbers that are going to come through?
So the liver disease would increase anyway. iLIFT isn't going to drive the increase in liver disease, and so the costs of the liver disease would carry on going up. So iLIFT is always going to be the cheaper option. So that one of the arguments about not doing this in the first place was that it was too expensive to do all of the screening in the first place. Now the reality is that a lot of the costs of that are GP time, nurse time in taking the bloods and repeating those cycles of bloods before you get onto the definitive one. And actually once you've got the blood in the lab, doing the rest of the tests becomes cost effective, as we've seen there, and it's certainly a very acceptable ISA. If we think of a willingness to pay of £30,000 per quality adjusted life year, and we're talking about 200, it's a no-brainer, and that then becomes a dominant life-saving strategy because of identifying patients earlier.
Any other questions? Anyone? No? Okay then, well I for one am very grateful because I can't remember that lecture back at medical school about liver function tests. That passed me by in a haze of probably I was hungover or on the river. So next week at Grand Rounds we have Eileen Keel from the Usher Institute who's going to come and talk about the financial implications of modern healthcare systems. She's one of our invited speakers. We now have an endowment which has been gifted to us by the medical director to fund people to come from external places. We'll fly them in and put them up somewhere. So if you have in mind an external speaker who'd like to come and the only thing that's stopping them is funding, then let me know. I could probably pull together some money. So Eileen Keel is coming next week. But a great round of applause for our speakers today. Thanks very much, and I'll see you all next week.